Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Heather Valutis. I'm the president and CEO of the Lancaster Chamber, and we're delighted to have you all here today. So thank you for joining us. We are here at the Southern End Community Association building for today's 100th District Primary Candidate Debate. I'm serving as today's moderator, and we're excited to be hosting this for all of you to gain more insight from both of the candidates running. There are two candidates running in this primary election to represent the southern end of Lancaster County in Pennsylvania's House of Representatives, and we are grateful they joined us here this evening. The Lancaster Chamber has been hosting candidate forums for more than 20 years to learn about the policy positions of the candidates and to discuss critical business issues, with the aim of helping voters make the most informed decision on Election Day. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all of you to please silence your cell phones and please refrain from taking pictures or video during the debate, as it can be quite distracting. The program is being live streamed on lancasteronline.com. It's also available on our Facebook page, and the recording will be made available after tonight's forum. So a full recording of today will also be available should you want to revisit it or share it with others. I'd also ask, and this is critically important for the speed and ease of this debate, that we refrain from cheering, jeering, applause, outbursts during the actual question time of this debate. We will try to maximize this 90 minutes. We're going to get through 10 preset questions, and then we're going to take questions that are submitted from all of you. So, before we go into any more of these house rules, we are going to welcome to the stage, and you may cheer for this portion, our two candidates. So please welcome Representative Bryan Cutler and Mr. Dave Nissley. Thank you. Okay. So the questions being posed to the candidates tonight will cover a wide range of business and community issues of interest and concern to the residents of the 100th District. The debate will begin with introductory remarks from both candidates and then move into moderated questions. Following that, we will invite the submitted questions from the audience. To that end, we have 3x5 cards that if you need one, raise your hand up, somebody can get you one, but they were around the room. So you can write your questions on those throughout the debate. The cards will be collected by members of our staff, so we have two here, and then we have others that will be around the room to collect your questions. Just raise it in the air. Do not feel like you need to move it forward. Just hold it up, and somebody will collect that from you. We also have received questions from those who wanted to submit ahead of time, and so if we get those, or we will have those here as well. Questions will only be accepted and even considered to be read if they are able to be directed to both candidates. That is important as you consider your questions for tonight. Just a few minutes ago, the candidates flipped a coin to determine the order of questions. Representative Cutler will have the first word, and Mr. Nissley will have the last word. So, we are going to begin. I also want to note they do have a countdown clock here. It's going to make a noise. Do not be alarmed when you hear that noise go off. It is just a timer to keep us moving here tonight. So, with that, I'm turning it over to Representative Cutler.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Heather, for hosting us. Before we start, I actually want to wish my grandmother a happy birthday. Today is her 89th birthday, and I certainly appreciate everything that she's done for me. I want to thank my wife and my family and my friends for being here. And Mr. Nissley, thank you for joining us as well. People often ask me, what do I get most excited about in this job? Or what am I most proud of? Was it winning my first election? Was it getting my first bill signed into law? Was it meeting different governors, being elected speaker, or briefing President Trump in the Oval Office on our election law challenges? While all of that has been an honor, I want to be very clear, that is not important. I was fortunate that very early on in my career, I had the ability to learn the true purpose of this job. You see, I had a young man named Noah who came into the office, and I've had him up at the Capitol several times, or one time, and then I see him several times since then. He was a young man who had a brain tumor, who needed treatment, and we were able to work through his medical issues with him because the treatment was only available in Texas. So now every year he stops at the Solanco Fair and we do a selfie, and it's particularly touching because he is the same age as our youngest. So my staff and I have been able to help thousands of people through that office, and that is exactly what this job is all about. It's about service. I know a lot of people tend to focus on the election itself and who has control, but this job is truly about serving our neighbors. And this campaign has certainly taken a negative tone by many of the outside groups that have chosen to come into it. And in fact, it's personally why I reached out to Mr. Nissley and asked if we could have coffee to share our testimonies when my wife and I's faith was questioned. He politely declined, but he did say something that did, in fact, stick with me that I think really speaks to the current nature of the race. He said that he intended to beat me. I understand that. That's exactly why we're both in this race. But while I understand the sentiment, I must confess that my why is slightly different. You see, I'm seeking another term because I want to serve our friends and our neighbors. I want to use my talents and what I've learned to do just that. Now, we do have an election, and I'll need to win that election in order to fulfill that role. But if the Lord has other plans, and I'm not blessed with another opportunity such as I've already had, then I will choose to serve our community in other ways. The truth is, this job's much more than campaigning. It's more than being a good door-to-door salesman. It takes focus and knowledge and understanding of the legislative process. I believe that you elected me to do a job and not campaign full-time for a job. And I understand that it takes balance and the support of my family to do this, and for that, I am forever grateful. So I'm glad that we can finally discuss my record in its entirety and many of the other issues that I am sure that will come up. It's my hope that as we dive into the facts about my record, that you will see it's one of conservative results.
Thank you. Mr. Nissley.
Well, thank you as well to each of you for coming. I see a lot of friends and family, and I appreciate that. There is this very famous line that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And when you take that in the context that it was written, it wasn't as evident to the king in England and the lords as it was to the people around. So they were that context was, we the people hold these truths to be self-evident. And of course it goes on, this is obviously the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And these principles and this freedom that they talked about then still lives in the hearts of people across the world, and specifically in Americans. And I have been so blessed and encouraged as I've knocked on many doors. I've seen many of you at your door. And as I summarize some of the things that you say that you want in your government and that what's important to you, I would say it this way: that you want to trust your government and its election. You want to know that your leaders are servants that speak and fight for you and do not become part of the ruling class. And that you want the government to be restrained in its constitutional cage, which of course is why the Constitution was written, to protect these liberties and gifts that God has given you, and to protect you from the government and tyrants. We have a duty as citizens to engage in a process of an election, and that's what makes Americans so beautiful, that we get to have this competition, if you will. Competition is actually one of the virtues and backbones of the American ideals. Our society wouldn't work without it. That's why government so often is less efficient than business, always less efficient than business, because it does away with competition too many times. And so I'm happy to engage in this. I'm so grateful to be here tonight. And tonight, as you listen, I trust that you will hear how I think. I want you to understand my worldview. Not just words, but the heart and the spirit and the behind the words. And so tonight, engage with us and enjoy the evening.
Great. Thank you both for your opening statements. We're now going to move into prepared questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question, and we will rotate the starting order each round. I will have the discretion to continue the dialogue in 30-second increments if needed. Okay, Representative Cutler, our first topic is going to be on state finances and the budget. According to the Independent Fiscal Office's 5-year outlook, the Commonwealth will deplete cash reserves in the general fund by 2026, and the rainy day fund will be depleted by 2028. If Pennsylvania continues to operate in a structural deficit, it could require tax increases or a reversal of the planned phase down of the corporate net income tax rate. What is your philosophy on managing the state's finances, and do you think the state should cut programs to balance the budget?
Thank you, Heather. Regarding the budget, I need to give a little bit of background in order to answer that question fully. I think it's important to note that when Governor Wolf first came in, we had $250,000 in our rainy day fund. We now have $6 billion because of the Republican House and Senate and the leadership that we showed as we managed our financial situation. And I will also point out that under Governor Corbett, we did in fact cut programs in terms of not replacing federal funds that had come down from the federal government. So that's the starting point. It was not easy to get there. I can basically sum it up really under the Dave Ramsey philosophy. You live within your means and you pay your bills. That's how we live our own personal life, and that's how we approach government. That's why we've been able to create this surplus. In addition to the rainy day fund with $6 billion, we've also managed to the point where we had a cash roll forward, which meant that at the beginning of every year, we no longer needed to borrow money in order to pay our bills. So we now lend that money to ourselves. We earn several $100 million in interest because of our improved finances. When we started, and it was during my first term in leadership as whip, we were basically 48th or 49th in terms of fiscal solvency. We're solidly now in the mid-20s. I think when we get re-rated because of our bond upgrade, it will improve even more. So that's kind of been the philosophy. The other philosophy, and I want to credit Chairman Grove with this, because this is not any single person who makes this a success. It takes a team approach. We can have 101 of the most conservative members ever, but if we do not get the 102nd vote, which is the majority, then it does not matter. You know, we can lead by example, which is what I've done. I've done that in my own personal office expenses. I post them online. I was one of the first in the state to do so. So I believe in transparency. I believe in accountability, and that's been the approach that we've brought to the budget.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Nissley.
So, you know, we live in Pennsylvania, which is one of the economic powerhouses of our nation. We have an amazing amount of natural resources, including its people. Our revenue in this state during the dates that Mr. Cutler just referenced have done nothing but go up. So to live within our means, it seems that would be normal. We should live within our means. Not only that, balancing a budget is required by the Constitution. It's our job as representatives. And so during the 18 years that Representative Cutler was in office, our overall state, not revenue, but our state grew by 70% in government costs. So I think that if we want to actually balance our budgets, and if we want to begin unleashing the economic powerhouse that this state really is, that we need to limit government, which I say every day and mean it, so that our state people can be set free to function. And I respect all the work you've done, but your record over 18 years is higher taxes in many ways. We really haven't had any tax cuts in these 18 years, even though the Republicans were in charge as in government. As having the governor, they had the state house and the Senate for some of the years that you were there. And so I know we're setting the tone for this whole debate and setting some basis, but again, this is just some context that we're in, that our government is much, much larger.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is on job creation and workforce talent attraction. Lancaster County's unemployment rate hit a historic low of 2.3% last November, and Pennsylvania's working age population continues to decline year after year. With a tight labor market and outward migration of workers, What do you feel is the state's role in workforce talent attraction and job creation? And we're starting that. Does anybody mind if I go to a first name basis here?
No.
Great.
ma'am.
We're going to start with you, Dave.
All right. So it's no secret that we have a retiring population across the country and right here in Pennsylvania too. Growing up in the construction world all of my life and still being there, the guys that I worked with, a lot of the guys I grew up working with are retiring as we speak at a rapid pace. In fact, I don't remember the numbers, but it's the retirement age, the people coming into the workforce and the people leaving is at a discrepancy right here in our own population. And so there's guys staying on longer than they anticipate because, number one, there's good jobs to be had in our county. Again, we have an economic powerhouse here, and one of the best ways to improve the ability for people to work is give them opportunity through training. And one of the things I'd love to see more of is what our school has, a private school in Gap has done in the last 8 years. They've taken a internship program and made it mandatory for the high school kids. And they have hundreds of businesses now participating in this and hundreds of students. Every semester, they switch to another company. And I've personally benefited from this as I've given my time as an employer to these students. I've trained them, taught them. Many of them don't stay in the field that they're in when I have them, but they've expanded their outlook, and they have a couple of them actually have come to work for us, and one of them is now one of our foremans, and he's doing designs and sales. And that's just an immediate result of being able to invest in kids and the younger generation and getting them started early.
Thank
you. Bryan.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an area where there is actually some pretty broad agreement. As I'm someone who went to trade school to start with, I was an X-ray tech originally, and that was a 2-year program. And when you look at that, I think that we encourage too many young folks to go into college, and that incurs a large amount of debt, and then oftentimes they struggle to find jobs. For too many years, our budget, and this is a good example of where we've realigned our priorities at the state level, for too many years, our budget would fund degrees and programs that didn't have jobs here that the employers needed. So then what happened was we acted surprised when these people chose to move out of the state and then ultimately not take the jobs that we actually needed, which creates the large vacancy rate that we currently see in many of the highest demand trade level positions. So we began focusing as House Republicans, we worked with our colleagues in the Senate on a variety of things. One, we looked at school funding and dual enrollment. We looked at dual enrollment for technical schools. We've done the internship path in terms of some of the other degreed licensed professionals because, for example, mental health counselors would have to work for a set number of hours and not be paid. But in order to work for that set number of hours, they would have to quit their jobs or not be working. And then that was a double negative because we couldn't get more counselors, and then in turn, they couldn't be paid or pay their bills, so then they would defer that. So we've taken a very focused approach to that because we recognize that workforce is an issue. Additionally, and this is a very important stat, the fastest growing age demographic, age 85 and older. That has 2 impacts. One, that means that we're losing too many young people and we're not filling in the bottom, as Mr. Nissley pointed out, in terms of a new workforce. But the other is ultimately if those individuals spend down all of their assets, they end up on Medicaid. Medicaid is already the largest single portion of our budget, and that's one of the biggest cost drivers at the state in terms of those costs.
Okay, thank you. This question is going to be on business climate in general. So earlier this year, Wallet Hub released a report that found Pennsylvania to be the 8th worst state to start a new business in, and we were ranked 44th in overall business environment when looking at criteria like business costs, access to resources, and startups per capita. What would you change or invest in to make Pennsylvania more business friendly? We're starting with you, Bryan.
All right, thank you, Heather. We've done several initiatives. As the House Republicans, we actually have what we call the Keystone Commitment. It focuses on a thriving economy, which is really the question that you're asking about. It involves business startups in regards to our Main Street initiative, because we understand that that is the backbone of our economy. Businesses like Mr. Nissley was just talking about, the smaller shops that start out with 1 or 2 people and then grow. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we have to keep the cost of government down. And that's one of the things that we have focused on in terms of controlling expenses. We're also looking to lower costs. One of the biggest unseen costs for any startup is the fact that it takes so long to get a permit in the Commonwealth. Our average wait time to get a permit to build a building is about 2 to 2.5 years here. And that is a huge detractor for new businesses to locate here. In fact, we've been told many times that businesses won't even put us on their radar because of our high corporate net income tax rate, then coupled with the difficulty in obtaining a permit. We have a natural gas-fired plant just across the state line right below us here. It's literally less than a quarter mile inside the Maryland border. Nobody assumes that Maryland is easier to do business. In fact, they typically rank right near us. But the one thing that they could provide that we could not as a state was predictability in terms of getting their permits. And that is a challenge. And that's us losing jobs. And that is ultimately something that we need to do. We need to do permitting reform. We need to keep the cost of government down because ultimately that'll lower the tax burden. That's why we cut the C&I tax. We have been doing tax cuts at the state level. We voted for several. Unfortunately, anytime that we work through the legislative process, we can pass things out of the House, but we have to get a Senate and a governor to agree, and sometimes that has been admittedly a challenge.
Great. Dave?
Yeah, so having started multiple businesses already, I know firsthand the difficulty of it from a regulation and from just the fees and the not, the paperwork and the time and the same as Bryan said, in the building industry, like to go from, it's the number one complaint I have other than property taxes is why is it so difficult to do something on my own property, like build a building? And so one of the where I would disagree, and I think that what we see as people that work in these businesses and live this life, we realize that the people are here. We're willing to do things. We're willing to be creative. We're willing to engage, put blood, sweat, and tears into business. We don't need even outside corporations, although not that it's all bad when a corporation comes into our community. Sometimes it is. But what we need is the freedom to have our business and to grow it and to expand it. I know so many small businesses that are restrained within the building that they might have a township code that keeps them from 5 employees or something. They would grow to 10 or 20 in a heartbeat if they would have the capacity from a structure point of view and just from a general regulation. So the best way to increase our business climate in this state, in this county, is to take the regulations down at the local level and have the state stand behind us instead of stand over us. Most of your township guys, what they struggle with is the fear of being sued by the state or the feds. And that's why they don't change their ordinances to make them more friendly, because they're taking this from the top down because of that fear. And so we got to take a step back. We got to reduce our size of government at the state level. The state's got to stand between the small guys and the federal level. That's their job.
Okay, thank you. All right, this one's going to Dave first. Governor Shapiro's state budget proposal rang in at $48.3 billion, a 7% increase from current spending. To raise additional revenue, he proposed a tax on legalized marijuana. Opponents of the plan think this won't be enough, and a property tax increase is inevitable. Can a property tax increase be avoided, and how do you feel the Commonwealth should drive revenues to manage budgetary needs?
Well, I don't think we should drive revenues to meet budgetary needs. We should reduce budgets to meet revenues. So if we're going to always come up with new taxations, we'll just always grow government. So let's cut government and keep our money. So that's it.
Okay. Bryan?
Yeah, first of all, I think legalizing marijuana is a bad idea on a whole host of fronts. I think that his plan is just very poorly conceived for a variety of reasons. That is truly a federal issue, being a level 1 substance. It creates all kinds of issues with employment, and most specifically gun ownership. I get a lot of calls at the office who were surprised if they took a medical marijuana card that couldn't cause them complications regarding firearm ownership. So I think expanding it even further is a bad idea. Regarding the revenue, I think that it's important to note that through good fiscal management, we've been able to thwart all of the governor's efforts, both Shapiro as well as previously Governor Wolf. None of his budgets ever passed. In fact, the one that did go up for a vote, the revenue plan, got 0 votes. Not even the Democrats would vote for it. So I think that's important to note. And it was because we stood in the way of those billions of dollars of tax increases. So I do agree that you have to live within your means. That's exactly what Mr. Nissley, I think, was saying in terms of making sure that rather than grow government to the revenue, you have to make sure that you keep expenses under what is projected to come in. We've been very fortunate. We had a booming economy. I think that there's some trouble on the horizon. That's why we have to protect the rainy day fund. That's why we have to protect the extra cash reserves that we have outside of the rainy day fund. The governor's proposal at $48.3 billion, and I want everybody to hear this, it took more than 8 years to save that money. 8 years. It will be gone in about 2 under his current rate of expansion. That is a significant problem that will absolutely result in tax increases, which is why we're fighting it.
Okay. This one is pretty straightforward. Describe your leadership style. How do you believe your leadership style sets you up for success in Harrisburg? Brian.
Thank you. I actually got the best compliment I could from one of the more conservative members of the caucus just this week. On the House floor, he pulled me aside and he said, you know, one of the things that I've noticed is that you're a members leader. In other words, we work to decentralize power. When I first came into office, all of the power was concentrated at the very top. The speaker and the leader were, in fact, the most powerful people. When I became leader, we ran one of the most aggressive legislative calendars in decades. And we passed a whole host of bills in 2019 and 2020, which I will point out, as many of us know, was not the easiest of times. And despite that, we passed about 648 bills to the governor's desk, 648 bills out of the House, 221 landed on his desk. 22 of those were vetoed. Most of those were COVID openers, and where we were pushing back on the business regulations that were there. And then ultimately we amended the state constitution. But we were able to do that because of our approach. I didn't say, you know, the speaker or the leader wants to run these bills. We went to the members. It was from bottom up. If the members could get something out of committee, we talked about it in caucus. If it could survive caucus, we moved it to the floor. And the amazing thing, because I know that I've been criticized for working across the aisle and being successful, which I find kind of ironic. But the amazing thing about that is, despite all the pushback that we were giving the governor, despite all the successes that we had, a variety of different bills, whether they were ag food bills, which we worked on, the AI funding, in terms of the avian influenza and the importance of that for our county, all of those things had bipartisan support, and almost two-thirds were unanimous. So it proves that you can work collaboratively and you can be successful with a conservative worldview. That's my leadership style.
Okay. Dave.
So, I've made a big deal about running this campaign to break up the top-down leadership that we have in Harrisburg. In spite of what Brian says, there's still this culture of top-down leadership. And we need to restore our Republican Party. And obviously, there's nobody here that wouldn't work with good-willed Americans across any aisle. But there's a video on your own website, Cutler, of in 2020 you're on the Capitol steps telling us the things that you've done and how you've come back and kept government open during COVID and all the important things you did. And then you said this. You were talking about the bills that you passed, and you said they passed unanimously and with strong bipartisan support, that even in the good times, most of the bills you pass in the House are like that. Well, if that's the kind of leadership we get, that his number one priority is passing bills and passing them with Democrats and passing them for governors to sign that are Democrats, it makes me suspicious that the principles aren't being held higher standard. So I would suggest, like Calvin Coolidge, which was, I think, one of the best presidents we ever had, especially from a small business perspective, he said, sometimes it's better to stop a bad bill than to pass a good bill.
Okay. I will circle back. We're going to keep moving. Okay, we're going to move on to education and a bit around school choice. So last year, a Commonwealth Court judge found Pennsylvania's school funding system unconstitutional and ordered the General Assembly to overhaul it. One proposed solution is the Pennsylvania Award for Student Success, which provides school choice vouchers for lifeline scholarships. Do you support these scholarships, and if so, how do you believe they assist students on their path to graduation and gainful employment? And Dave, we'll start with you.
So school choice is obviously a topic that's near and dear to almost every family because you either have grandchildren or children in school. And our school issues are deep because the funding that it requires, the amount of our budget that's used for schools is incredibly high and it's going up. And in spite of that, our education's not necessarily getting better. So school choice, in my opinion, the money needs to follow the children, pure and simple. And that has to happen with competition. Every state that has implemented these type of reforms has seen education improve, costs go down per student. It's not complicated. Might be difficult to push through a House and Senate that might not want to do it, but the people are behind it. So if we give strong leadership in this, we can get school choice where all of our schools improve. Our public schools will improve when we give them competition.
Okay. Bryan?
Yes, I supported the bill. I voted for the bill, and I defended it when it came back from the Senate when the Democrats stripped it out. I think that's important to note. I've consistently supported school choice. My kids all went to public school right here in Solanco. And I will point out that not everybody has the opportunity to have the same level of education that I was afforded when I was there with Mrs. DeBernine, my 6th grade teacher who I see sitting out in the audience. Thank you for being here. And Mrs. Herr, my 10th grade math teacher. I wasn't as successful in her class, so that was Mrs. D's, if I was very honest. But the reason I share that is because I realize that not every child has that opportunity. You should not be trapped by a zip code forcing you to go to a poor performing school. What the PASS program did that you outlined was take that bottom 15% of the students in the failing schools and give them a lifeline out of there, hence the name. And that is fundamentally important. You know, for too long, we have been investing more and more money with less accountability and getting bad results. Everybody likes to point to COVID as the reason that the schools are struggling, and that was an abysmal failure of government to allow those schools to be shut down by the governor. That's why we pushed back and ultimately passed the constitutional amendment, I'm assuming with many of your votes and support during the 19, 20, 21, 22 sessions. That's important because while that impacted the scores negatively, those scores were already declining long before COVID when you drill into the actual data. And that's important. I'm a data-driven person. I will freely admit that I'm a nerd. And it's important to understand what that data means and where it goes and what it tells you about our current population. Students are struggling today. There's a variety of reasons why they are struggling. And in terms of the opportunity, though, that is something that we can actually provide. That's why I've consistently voted for it and supported it.
Okay. We're going to use housing as an example here related to the regulatory environment. A 2022 housing analysis conducted by the Economic Development Company of Lancaster County determined that Lancaster is at least 7,000 to 12,000 housing units behind what is considered a healthy vacancy rate. Housing developers have attempted to build more, but they're often held back by regulatory burdens from DEP and excessively long wait times for permit approval. How would you address permitting reform and DEP oversight to make Pennsylvania's regulatory environment better? And we're starting with Bryan.
Regarding our permitting problems, that is one of the biggest cost drivers of housing. I spoke with a couple from Mardick Township who had a 10-acre lot at the Solanco Fair a couple years ago, and they were $80,000 in on engineering fees and permitting fees, and they had not broken ground yet. And they were not building a big home. It was under 2,000 square feet, they had an oversized garage. He was a welder and wanted to work from home, and so he needed a place to put his truck. You can't have a real discussion about affordable housing when you have $80,000 in additional fees on top of that. The other issue that we oftentimes have, and many times our policies are at conflict with one another in terms of what that means for housing prices. we say 2-acre lot minimums in a lot of the townships because we like open space, but that also drives up the underlying cost of land. And that is a big problem. When you layer on the permitting fees, that further adds to the cost. Obviously, we've all seen the failed federal policies that have led to record inflation and driving that, which then drives up material costs. And when you get into a world where you're waiting 2 years for a permit, that just means that the inflation just keeps running the entire time you're waiting to build your home. That's unacceptable. Representative Zimmerman has a great bill to start with. I don't remember the number, but it deals with the NPDES permits, which is related to ground disturbance. We should immediately go to the federal levels. That's something that we've advanced in the House before, I think, and it should be again. We've also got a series of bills. Representative Kiefer had one that would have repealed unnecessary regulations. We called it the Office of the Repealer. And all of those things contribute to the impacts on housing costs. I am very worried that my children will not be able to afford to live here. And we've been here since 1800 in the township. So that is a very real concern for my wife and I. And it's a concern for them as they're looking to get jobs and further their own careers. So we can improve the regulatory environment. We can improve the timing, because the timing will also increase the improvements there in terms of costliness of homes.
Dave.
So housing costs are obviously a factor. Some of it's just sheer inflation. But the regulatory process is overwhelming. And all of you know that. You don't need anecdotal stories. You have your own. What's disturbing is that it's ever increasing. So in 2008, when Obama took office, one of the very first things he did with a signature, a small order, he asked the EPA to change the regulations on the stormwater runoff into the Chesapeake. It affected every single citizen here. What's probably the most frustrating thing about that is that our state just acquiesced to it. I mean, yeah, they fought some, but really they've just shifted that burden to the counties and the counties to the township. And so that stormwater process has become this massive, bulky cost, whether it's the engineering, the installation, and just the sheer atrocity of the beast. And what bothers me when I hear this talk for years out of Harrisburg is that in spite of all the talk, the regulations go up and the costs go up, and they never come down. So I think that we need to take a different approach. We need a state government that stands for the people against the federal government. Think Abbott in Texas, with the border. This is the kind of leadership that our state needs to take. Yeah, we have a Democrat governor. He's not going to do it at the moment. But that can change. We've had Republican governors. They haven't done a thing. So it's time our state takes a stand for the people and reduces our costs and regulations.
Okay, we're going into the final 3 questions here. So if you do have a question that you're going to submit, feel free to raise it in the air and staff will collect it from you. Okay, this one is on farmland preservation. Lancaster County is a leader both nationally and in Pennsylvania in farmland preservation. What do you believe is the state's role in maintaining access to farm fresh food and investing resources in rural development and/or preservation? And we're starting with Dave.
The best way to preserve farmland in Lancaster County is to farm it. So if you're going to farm it, it has to be profitable. For it to be profitable, you have to have the liberty to farm it the way that it's profitable, not the way the government tells you to farm it. So that means we've got to reduce regulations. Again, Cutler or any other representative could have went to Amos Miller's farm the other week when he was raided. And right or wrong with Amos Miller, but if you would have stood there and drank a glass of milk and put a mustache on TV, nobody would vote you for it. A white mustache would win you elections because they would see that you're willing to stand for personal liberties and the right to work and the right to operate your farms at a profit and to sell your goods to your friends and neighbors. I'm not making a statement about Amos Miller. I'm making a statement about the government that is over-regulating us and our neighbors. Thank you.
Okay. Bryan?
Mr. Nissley is correct on one point. Farming needs to be profitable. I absolutely agree with that. I think the best way to do that is to ensure that they have an appropriate supply chain and we have access to fresh food. I don't disagree with him at all on that. I would, however, encourage him to look into some of Mr. Miller's other practices regarding payment of taxes. And food freedom. I have actually been up to a farm up there, and I don't know if it was Amos's or not, very early on to discuss raw milk and the permitting process that was involved there. We're one of the few states that actually does that. We have 130 or so permits, if I recall correctly, and that is the current system. And I think the Bible is very clear that God appoints people over us, and that the proper way to work through the process is not simply ignoring the law. What we should do is honor those in that position, and we should appropriately challenge it from the inside with making changes legislatively. I think that does raise some concerns with me, because look, Mr. Miller's problems are with the federal government and interstate transport. That's the realities, because I have actually talked to the people that are involved there. And we can have an honest discussion about food freedom, and I think it's appropriate. We raise a lot of our own food, but I think that we have to respect the process and live within that process. And we can celebrate our freedoms in that world and do it with a conservative worldview. And that is what I've advocated for time and time again in terms of that approach, because we can do that. And we are blessed to live in the best country in the world. And we have the ability to stand here and disagree. But what we should not do is take the process out of context and turn it into an us versus them discussion, which is where it always goes. This isn't about a choice between freedom and friendship. You can have both.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
No, we're going to keep moving. We're going to touch on voting access here. So who we elect to office has a significant impact on our businesses, communities, and households. A voter ID constitutional amendment was introduced by House Republicans this year with the intention of enhancing election integrity. Do you support the implementation of voter ID at the polls or any other measures to safeguard Pennsylvania's elections?
Yes.
We're starting with you.
Yes, sorry, Heather.
Go for it.
I was keeping the tally sheet. Yes, I support voter ID. I voted for it the first time in 2010 and consistently voted for it every time that it comes up. In fact, it played a role when we lost votes for the speakership. The gentleman who agreed to switch parties agreed to run voter ID. Ultimately, while he went back on that promise, the truth is that was a large portion of that discussion, and you can go back and check the media discussions during that time. Voter ID is very important because it ensures the integrity of our elections. That's why I've supported it. Furthermore, and I want to get into the voting access, I think that we win because we have better ideas as Republicans. I'm not worried about people voting. I also want to point out that we have consistently litigated in favor of voter ID, signature requirements, dating absentee ballots, all of those things. In fact, we just won a case last week. And it was because myself and the Senate leaders are continuing that fight. And this is a perfect area where there's been a huge misrepresentation. Act 77 as a bill is very different than what the courts rewrote. I've seen claims that Act 77 had drop boxes in it. I would encourage everybody to please go read the bill. Drop boxes are nowhere there. In fact, I have voted against drop boxes twice. Now, who did create drop boxes were the counties. We challenged them in court. The Supreme Court, which is 5-2 Democrat, said that they were acceptable. We lost control of the Supreme Court in 2015 because we had 18% voter turnout. We lost 3 seats. We went 0 for 3. And that's a challenge when we don't have voter participation. When individuals like Mr. Nissley do not participate by voting in that election, I think that it's very important. You know, This job is very serious. You have to understand bills, you have to understand the process, and you have to vote.
Okay. Dave?
So there's a lot of talk about voter ID in the last couple months, especially from the Republican leadership. I wonder why. Because Act 77 and the number one concern that the voters talk about, not even a close, the number one concern is election integrity. And, you know, no matter what happened in 2020, I can tell you something that's a result of it, and that is we have a limited trust in our system right now. And trust is fragile. It's difficult to restore. But I can tell you that trust, in spite of anything that Cutler or any other leader in the House tells you about Act 77 fundamentally changed our voting process in Pennsylvania. And it was pushed by Representative Cutler. It was advanced. He was a majority leader at the time. It's his job to take bills. It's his job to take them out of committee, to work them. And Act 77 is your gift from him. We had day of voting, in-person voting, for decades, and it worked. And we knew who won usually that evening. Somehow, we were so smart that we needed to fix it. None of us knew there was anything broken. But now there is. One thing that's broken tremendously is our trust.
Okay. This is the last of the pre-made questions. So this one is going to focus on tourism for a minute. And it's going to go to Dave first. The Lancaster County Visitors Economy Report, published in May of 2023, tells us that state and local tax revenue generated by the tourism industry generated over $2 billion for the economy and saved each Lancaster County household from paying an additional $1,000 in taxes in 2022. Yet the state has made very little investment in the tourism industry. Knowing that parts of this district thrive on tourism and hospitality, what do you think is the state's role in supporting tourism?
You know, if the revenue from tourism is that incredible, why does the state need to be involved?
Okay. Bryan?
Yeah, thank you. I know that we have this discussion very frequently. And one of the things that actually, and I'll give Representative Boyd credit when he was here, he actually encouraged the tourism industry to develop an internal system where it could be self-funding. I think that was a good approach. I think that was an appropriate approach because one of my concerns is the need for industry to rely on government. When you look at that process, it creates problems. And I'll use an example. During the impasse in 2016, Governor Wolf's first budget asked for $12 million in tax increases. Bills weren't paid for the better part of 10 months. And, you know, I know the tourism industry was impacted. Had they been self-funded, it would have certainly helped them.
You guys are so timely today. We're really cruising.
You got a really loud horn.
It does have a horn. It helps. Okay, so thank you for your answers to those questions. We are now going to move into questions that were submitted both today and via a form that we had online prior to today's forum. So we'll ask as many as we can get to that are pertinent to today's discussion areas. The first one we're going to start with, where am I at? Okay, there's a debate in Harrisburg now about how municipal water authorities should operate. Some say private businesses are better at running water and sewer services than local municipalities. Where does each candidate stand on this issue? And that's going to Bryan first. Sorry.
Thank you, Heather. This is actually an issue that's very close to home here. For those who might not be aware, Chester Water Authority is under threat of an imminent takeover. I can tell you that in the law, that is something that had been put in place to reform that system, and we have successfully defended that up until this point. In fact, this is one of the advantages of having me as your representative and being in a leadership role. Twice they've tried to legislatively do it, and we've been able to keep it out because I knew where to find it in the bills and where to look for it. I've talked to the workers. Their biggest concern, both from the workers and the ratepayers piece, is what will happen to the current plant, what will the infrastructure be, and most importantly, what will their rates be. I do agree that private business does a lot of things very, very well. But I don't think that a hostile takeover is, in fact, the best approach. When you talk to the ratepayers, they're talking about projected, because remember, they're a regulated utility. What that means is they will get a guaranteed rate of return far into the future. And I think it's important to let the ratepayers have the voice in that discussion, which is what our reforms did about 10 to 12 years ago. We allowed each municipality that was impacted by Chester Water Authority, and the fight is really a legal one over who owns the authority. The city of Chester claims they do. And the board, though, was abrogated, completely removed, and was replaced with members from each area. Now, does that mean that they could eventually vote to sell? It does, but at least they have a voice in that process.
Dave?
I don't obviously have a lot of expertise on Chester Water Authority. I've heard from a lot of residents on that issue. But, I do, in my township where we live, one of the difficulties we have with housing as far as multifamily or anything like that is we don't have public water at all. And this has been an ongoing discussion for years and years and years. We have for years, decades in Pennsylvania, had this hybrid between private utilities and government with our utilities. And obviously, if you're going to have that, you're always going to have to work at it. Like, there's this blend between those two. So I don't have a lot of comments about it. It's an issue, but I don't think that we're dying to hear about it.
Okay. I'm going to try to combine two things here because they pertain to the same thing. So Pennsylvania has the second highest gas tax in the nation, and it was raised in Harrisburg 11 years ago. A lot of that money was used for mass transit systems in both Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And since our mass transit and roads are still crumbling, and this district specifically is of a rural nature, this is where it's kind of a two-part question. What do you plan to do to make fuel more affordable since we don't have public transportation? And would you support another gas tax hike?
I would not support a gas tax hike. We all know that our gas taxes are high, and many of you know because of this campaign that Cutler voted for that bill in 2013 that did give us these high gas taxes. I could fly from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh on Frontier next month for $19, almost any day of the week, nonstop, good flight, assuming Frontier gives good flights. It would cost me $100 in tolls alone without Easy Pass on the turnpike, plus the fuel if I were to drive that. Competition is a miracle worker. Government doesn't have any. This is a problem. We need to reduce our taxes across the board. Of all the things that Representative Cutler has voted for, the ones that have passed have raised our taxes. The ones that haven't would have reduced our taxes, but they don't pass. He's been in leadership. He's been there for 18 years, claiming that experience, but there's no change except that our taxes go up. These aren't my records, they're his, and we all experience them. Gas taxes, property taxes, every tax needs to be reduced.
Okay, Bryan?
Good news, Mr. Nissley. We actually did vote to reduce the gas tax recently, and we were ruled out of order by the Speaker because we actually agree with you. Act 89, and the history is important. We had 10 years of no investment in terms of maintenance or bridges, and the entire Lancaster County delegation worked together. We worked with the Chamber and the other partners here in the area. The ag community came together because we had the Holtwood Bridge be shut down because they broke a beam. Act 89 funds allowed that to be repaired in a very timely manner. Now, the tolls, while extremely high, and I avoid the turnpike as often as I can. The truth is that has nothing to do with Act 89. And this is one of my concerns with this campaign, is the misinformation and misdirection. Many of these comments are simply designed to get people angry. That's it. I'm angry too. I just know who to fight. And that's why we've been pushing back on the governor. That's why we think that electric vehicles should actually pay their fair share. But I'll tell you what I don't believe. I don't believe that we should do it like other states. Other states charge hundreds of dollars in personal property taxes on their vehicles. And it doesn't matter if you're a grandmother who drives to church and the store once a week, you'll pay $600 in some states for your vehicle registration. Additionally, the state of Virginia has an extra 1% to 1.5% in sales tax. That's how they fund their roads. The discussions were had. There are challenges with the current system. I'm not a fan of putting black boxes in to measure mileage because that's what some other states are doing. So the gas tax is the closest thing to a user fee. I will tell you, as someone who drives all over the state, I've done a variety of paths and routes, like I said, to avoid the turnpike. In 2016, when we were fighting Governor Wolf, I put 44,000 miles on my car. I understand the impact of a gas tax. That's why we believe it should be reduced and why we were working towards that.
Okay. This one is starting with you, Bryan. One group that has struggled the most economically one group that has struggled the most economically are the physically and mentally disabled. What are your plans to help this disenfranchised group?
Well, we've actually done a lot in this world. I had a series of bills, Representative Mari Garrick had the first one, that would encourage employment. We do a wonderful job of caring for the physically and mentally disabled up through the point when they age out of many of the programs. And sometimes their health care can become a burden on the family. So we had a bill, it's called the I Want to Work 2.0 bill, that would encourage disabled individuals to become employed. The best way that we can ensure that we don't spend money on programs is to ensure that everybody gets good paying jobs. That's what that proposal is. We just recently had some debate on that as well. The other areas that I think are also important is recognizing the support structures that the family needs in terms of meeting some of their other needs. There's adaptive equipment lines, wheelchair lines, things like that in the budget as well that have historically been there that constantly get reevaluated. And those are some areas that we have worked on. I think that it's noble to have a job. We've also, we just don't apply that to that community. We apply it to many of the welfare programs. That's why we voted for welfare to work. So we recognize the challenges in the workforce. I think they're a great area of a potential resource or a pool for future employees.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, so just a comment on the previous question and the gas tax to fix our bridges, and yet most of us in the district could name 2 or 3 bridges that have a pile of gravel in front of them suddenly one day. So that's just the disappointment with that kind of bureaucracy. Regarding this question, obviously a people such as ourselves, we value life and all life. And so it's no surprise that our communities, our churches, our families, and our government engages in taking care of people. And so I think Cutler and I would probably find lots of ways to agree with this. I think one of the ways that I think we would both agree that we need to take care of people, and some of the best ways to do that is to give the families better ways to do it, just by getting out of the way sometimes, or helping them find the resources. So, but yeah, it's obviously an issue that we all care about because we do care about people and life.
Okay, we're going to do a set of election-related questions here. We're going to start with one and then go into others. Are you in favor of mail-in ballots for all? And that's starting with Dave.
So this is a great discussion, but we had absentee ballots for years, and they worked for the people that need them. And under the current circumstances with what we've went through for the last 5 or 6 years, my position is that we need to repeal Act 77 and go back to day of voting and in person, because we don't need or want 50 days of voting in this country.
Okay, Bryan.
I think it's important to note what the mail-in balloting program actually does and didn't do, and what the court did to it. We actually copied word for word the absentee ballot requirements into the mail-in piece. That was how the law was written. So much so that they actually transferred a typo that later needed corrected. So in regards to access to ballots, I sum it up very simply. I believe that we should make it easy to vote, hard to cheat. That's why all the security pieces were in there. That's why, and a lot of folks are surprised to know this, when you apply for a mail-in ballot, you have to have a social security number or your driver's license number. It is trackable online with our county. They will tell you when your ballot is sent, when it is returned, and when it is processed. I raised concerns in February of 2020 regarding the lateness of the ballots. I specifically addressed that. And unfortunately, Governor Wolf vetoed the bills that would have corrected that area. I recognize that there are major problems because of what the court unconstitutionally rewrote. We took 2 cases to the United States Supreme Court over mail-in ballots. They allowed about 9,600 ballots to come in late. And that was a challenge that we took up both before and after the election, and because I believe that those votes were not legal. The law is very clear. When you have people who don't follow the law, such as occurred in that case, you do cause questions, and that is a big problem. But what we have to recognize is the changes, the fundamental changes that the court made in order to ensure that they would further rewrite that system. They got rid of the date requirement, the signature requirement, secrecy envelopes, all of those things that were required. And it's also important to note that the absentee law does not apply to people who go on vacation. And I had a Republican stand up at a town hall meeting and said, I went on vacation and missed voting for the first time. The reality is not every county was checking it.
Okay. I'm going to ask the question because I had it in this order to do it, but you've both kind of touched on it. Do you think Act 77 in 2019 that legalized no excuse mail-in voting is a good thing? Why or why not? You can expand however you want on your election thoughts. Bryan.
Sure. I'll pick up where I left off there before the horn went. The problem with Act 77 is it was completely rewritten by the courts, and that has caused problems. That's why Senator Ahmet put in a bill, I believe, to temporarily suspend mail-in ballots. That's why we tried to reform the system and put the safeguards back in place. But until we get a court that is willing to actually follow the law, that will be difficult going forward, or a governor to sign. So that has caused some significant hurdles. I think that one of the other issues that you have to understand is that court only exists because of low voter participation in 2015. That's the only reason they gained control of the court. It's a huge problem. And, I'm somebody who has worked my poll for the last 2 decades, talking to voters, discussing issues, and understand that. And the problem that we ran into was, quite frankly, the Republicans were following the rules. And if they were not sick and homebound or out of district for the entirety of the day, that is, in fact, what absentee ballots cover. Whereas other counties were not asking the questions. They just wouldn't ask. So we had de facto mail-in balloting already in some counties. And I had one gentleman stand up at a town hall meeting, and this was a direct quote. He said, "I'm really upset about Act 77. Every time I ever went on vacation, I was able to vote." And I just correctly pointed out, "I understand, sir, but that's illegal." And that's a problem. Because there, again, you have different enforcement of the laws. The lack of uniformity of the application is what causes problems. The courts rewriting that law is what causes problems. And because of that, many of the security features were gone. And it's also important to note that every major stakeholder signed off on that. From all the major campaigns, from the president down to the state level, everybody signed off on it, and they were comfortable with it because of the security provisions. And that's what was attacked systematically by the D.C. Democrats the minute that law went into effect.
Okay. Dave.
So still, now that in public you've gotten to hear him, Cutler has never taken responsibility for this act and this law. The courts did interpret the law correctly and possibly incorrectly, probably incorrectly. But the bill was passed by Representative Cutler. It's his bill. He pushed it through. The courts did not legalize unlimited 50-day voting. Cutler did. The bill is what fundamentally changed our voting system in Pennsylvania. The courts only interpreted the bill. So while there's a lot of excuses, the bill that passed is the bad one. All the things that Cutler has voted for since to fix it didn't pass. This is poor leadership to pass the bill the first time, and it's obviously a lot of excuses since. I'm one person, but this is the common refrain across the state. Well, in my county, but it's a state issue. We don't trust the system. And it's not because the courts messed it up. It's because Act 77 was passed. We need to repeal it. We need to take ownership of it and turn it over. It's that simple. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a lot of will. We're going to have to gain seats in the House again, which we haven't done under his leadership. We've lost seats, lots of them. We've lost the majority. And this is the leadership that's failing us. We are in a managed decline, and it's difficult for us to talk about things like election integrity when we know that to fix this, we need to have energy and enthusiasm backing our party to gain voters, to then gain seats, and to gain a majority, and to beat the Democrats.
Bryan, you get 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think it's important to note that while we did start with a majority of 121 seats, the organization that cost us our very first seat in Delaware County was CAP, the organization that is supporting Mr. Nissley. They cost us a primary, and then they could not carry the general election because they elected someone who was not electable. Furthermore, I understand that Mr. Nissley may voice all of these concerns now in the realm of the campaign. Interestingly enough, he's never once contacted me, and in fact, he didn't vote in 2019. And I think that that is rather unfortunate, because you heard him say at the very beginning that participation is very important and voting is very important.
Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. What is your plan for constituent outreach given the size of this district? So we're starting that with Dave.
I'm sorry, can you rephrase the question?
What would be your plan for constituent outreach given the size of this district?
So obviously being available, it's if we're going to be a representative, our district is only 65,000 people, and relative to most states, it's a fairly small size. And geographically, yes, we're bigger than some, but we're much smaller than others. Availability is a key part of representative government, being able to speak to people. And I will say, Cutler has been a hard worker. I will give him that. He's certainly not lazy, and I appreciate that. But what we need, obviously, is representative government. And for representative government to work, I have to have a voice in Harrisburg, and you have to have a voice with me. If the representative voice in Harrisburg is closed down because of top-down leadership, if there's no pluralism at the table, then you have no voice. And so I think that this is a key part of this race. It's the people saying we need representation. And we need that representation to follow through in Harrisburg. And I know that Cutler claims to have reformed a lot of our party systems and mechanisms, but the truth is we are being strangled at the top by leadership that doesn't relate to the people. A lot of that comes down to things like term limits, and people want that. Maybe they don't. Maybe we don't know why or how exactly it looks. We just don't want career politicians. We are tired of this status of getting a leadership position because of seniority, and then controlling that and managing it and holding on to it and protecting it. And that's what we're seeing. It's a problem in human organizations everywhere, but it's especially bad in government because it's so hard to break into it.
Perfect timing. Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Nissley, for your compliment. I do appreciate it, and I would agree, and I think my family would agree that we do work very hard. Because the truth is I could not do this job without my family's support, and I appreciate their willingness to allow me to minister in this way. just last week I had my birthday, and you asked how we stay in contact. One of the things I do is regularly attend meetings, even though township meetings. It could be school board meetings. It could be fire hall meetings. On my birthday, I started my morning in Salisbury at 7 a.m. at a township supervisor meeting. I went to a series of one-on-one constituent meetings throughout the district who had called and asked questions. Then did dinner at a fire hall here in Quarryville to thank those guys for everything that they are doing, the guys and the ladies. And later that night, I ended my evening at Salisbury Township and attended their township meeting, which, by the way, had an amazingly high turnout. So I'm not, may not be in tune with all of the issues you have going on locally there, but there was a lot of people there for 9 o'clock at night. And I was able to go home and then celebrate my birthday with my wife and my kids at the end of the day. That's how I approach the job. That's how we do outreach. When we kept track of the people that come in and out of the office, we routinely would have somewhere around 50 to 60,000 contacts per year. That's letters, calls, emails. I will admit, since attaining leadership, and respectfully, we've changed that model. We changed that model, and I broke the status quo because I was elected into leadership after only being there 8 years. And we have decentralized the power, as I detailed earlier. We broke down to the committee level how to run bills, because it's not about what I want or what you want. The legislative process is built on collaboration. You have to get 102 votes in order to be successful. And that also means that sometimes you don't get everything that you want. So I will gladly discuss my voting record in any of the other issues that we talk about. And I acknowledge where I have made shortfalls, and more importantly, I acknowledge where we can improve. I lead by example.
Okay. How would you counter, I believe this person is saying Department of Education, bureaucracy in Pennsylvania government and schools? Thank you. Okay. What are you going to do to counter diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy in Pennsylvania government and schools? And that goes to Bryan first.
Yeah. That's actually been a very hot topic recently in Harrisburg, and the DEI initiatives have really been a challenge because, if I'm being quite honest, it doesn't meet my worldview. That's not how I look at the world. I believe that we can love everybody. I believe that we can include everybody, but I also don't believe that our children should be indoctrinated. And that's one of the issues that we have worked on. Representative Barb Gleim has been a leader in that. We fought child pornography as well with her. And one of the things that I've always consistently done as a leader is work with the members. And I think that it's important to note that. When Representative Gleim had an idea, we supported her. That's actually the role of a good leader, a good servant leader. And so we have looked at those areas, we have pushed back, and most importantly, and a lot of this is being pushed from the federal government, which is also a challenge. The reality is many of these challenges are being forced into and politicizing, whether it's at the library or our schools or where our children are. That's why we need to push back, because I believe that it's a parent's right to decide what their kids learn. I believe that it's a parent's right to decide what they are exposed to, and most importantly, when they are exposed to it. I believe that we can have a free society, but I also believe that we should have a respectful one.
Okay. Dave.
Obviously, DEI and some of those crazies do not have a place in our schools. And the people in your schools, the parents and the teachers and the school boards, would stop it if they could, and they're working on it. So again, we need the bureaucracy out of the way. They're protecting these crazies. They're protecting the ideas that we don't want in our schools. And unfortunately, the bureaucracy operates on money, and our government has grown 70% in size since Cutler's been in office. So in 18 years, a 70% growth. Bureaucracies would starve if they wouldn't have money. It's one way of tackling it. But if we're going to keep funding them at the state levels and the federal levels, then we've got to be able to fight them at the local level. And for that, then we need people that will stand in the gap as well. So it's a two-pronged thing. It's a big issue. We need representatives that stand in between, and we need representatives that go on the offense in Harrisburg and reduce the bureaucracy, that regulations are not laws. We had an opportunity to do a constitutional amendment that would have given the legislatures the ability to override regulations, and that wasn't passed because it needed to go through the House one more time, and we lost the majority in the House, and then we voted for the Speaker Razi, and consequently, there goes the constitutional amendment. This is poor leadership. This is the kind of stuff that needs to stop. This is the managed decline of our state by the Republican Party is not acceptable.
Okay, I'm going to build off this person's question a little bit. Can you share a little bit about your perspective on energy policy for the Commonwealth? And this person specifically asked about increasing solar energy. So if you want to lean into that. Dave, that's you first.
Yeah, so Pennsylvania is energy rich. Many of you know that we have natural gas that is tremendously abundant. In this past year, natural gas was so cheap that lots of the wells were capped. Brand new wells drilled, they're just being held until you can afford to, it's not worth selling the gas. That's how inexpensive it is. But for some reason, it's not translating to us. So there we go again. Where's the disconnect between the very available and very inexpensive gas that we have right here in our state and as an end user? And this whole solar initiative from the federal government, my brother and I have participated in this. They are paying so much money for you to put solar on your house or at your business that the return on it with the grants, it pays for the system in no time, like a couple years or less. And so you got to ask yourself, where's that money coming from? And our state participates in this as well. So the bureaucracy is just overwhelming, and it is a means for the individuals to get tax money back and to get their electricity cheaper because they're participating in this system. But the system itself is driving up the overall cost to our electricity for the end user in general, because the green initiatives that our state has adopted is making the utilities buy this green energy and prove that they're buying it. And so the cost is going up for the end user. Once again, the government gets involved, and the end user tends to be the one that struggles the most.
Okay, Bryan.
Thank you. I wasn't aware that you participated in the solar, Mr. Nissley, but appreciate that perspective. I think our energy policy really needs to focus more on what we already have instead of where the government, particularly the federal government, wants to take us. We have the largest natural gas deposits in the world outside of Texas. We're literally the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. The other piece, a lot of people say let's do solar because it's good for the environment. That's one of the reasons that people say let's do it. The truth is we converted all of our coal plants to natural gas plants. We already hit the environmental standards that were set with the Paris Accords. If we were an independent country, we would have unilaterally met it because of our energy transformation that is going on right here in Pennsylvania. The disconnect, I can answer that question. The disconnect is we don't have enough pipelines, and that's the reality. When you look at what happened over here with the protests and the permitting problems that were with the pipelines, that is why the cheap market cannot get the gas and why they are capping wells. And at least they were intellectually honest. The protesters said we need to stop the pipeline because if we stop the pipeline, then we'll stop the fracking. And that's what they were objecting to. And that is a huge, huge impact on our electric prices. And I need everybody to understand something. In addition to, put your hand up if your electric bill went up in the last 2 years. I think everybody's going to put their hands up. It's about 40%. 40%. And the reason for that is because of the failed energy policies at the federal and the state level, some of which are the solar subsidies. The problem with that is that it's some of the most expensive energy to produce, absent the write-offs. It's some of the most expensive energy to produce. And then you couple that with the fact that you still have to build backbone. You still have to build baseload energy generation. And that is the problem. Because you're still going to build the gas plants, they just might not run as often. Mm-hmm. And for me, I want my light switch to work when I go and hit it. So I think that we need to look at cheap, reliable alternatives, not government mandates.
Okay, this is the last one we're going to take that was submitted. What do you believe are your qualifications for the office of representative that you are seeking? And we're starting with Bryan.
Thank you. I've had the opportunity to serve in this role for some time with a variety of experiences, and it's been a privilege. It's been an honor. I realize that we sometimes don't work in the way that everybody in this room would agree. But that is a collaborative process, and I understand and respect that. I understand that Mr. Nissley has some concerns regarding my approach, but I'd like to talk about my qualifications because I think that it is important. I've been able to work collaboratively, despite some people saying that that's not how we should be, because I think at the end of the day, we want a government that works. I think that we want a government that is smaller and more efficient and can live within its means. That's been our consistent approach. That does not mean that we always get everything that we want. In fact, unfortunately, we had 8 years of Governor Wolf. You know, I recognize that Mr. Nissley has a lot of concerns about my record in the 18 years there. I'll simply point out we've only had a Republican governor for 4 of them. Part of that reason is, once again, low voter participation, and Mr. Nissley particularly. He did not vote against Governor Wolf when he ran for re-election in 2018. We wouldn't have had to deal with a second round of Governor Wolf had we been able to elect our candidate. That's an issue. And, you know, I do agree with him with what he said at the beginning. It is important that we be involved. I've got the experience. I've got the outreach in terms of hearing from constituents. I've always made myself available, and I appreciated the good gentleman's compliment regarding my work ethic. Most importantly, I grew up here. I'm a lifelong resident. That's somewhere that I'm very proud of because our family's been here. We know each other. We go to church together, and we serve one another. That is the very backbone of our community. That's why I believe that I'm qualified to represent our community, and I would humbly ask for your support going forward.
You know, I have participated in business myself for years. I've started businesses, and I've run my business debt-free. I've started it that way and run it for 31 years that way. My worldview from an economic perspective is very simple. You live within your means, you grow your business, you work hard. And I think that when you look at government, that the same idea should translate. Ideally, it would translate easily. But we're in a difficult situation in America and in Pennsylvania where we've grown our government so large, it's out of its constitutional cage. And we really are going to have a lot of will, a lot of energy and enthusiasm to put this back. You know, it's going to take things like myself. I've already said I won't take a pension. Pension's not even a word in my vocabulary prior to this race. As a self-employed person, you don't have pensions. Many of you work in jobs that you don't get a pension. Cutler's taking pension on 13 years of his service, and at the same time he was saying that he refused a pension. And this is the kind of big government that we need to stop. We need to stop the pay raises that are automatic in Pennsylvania. Again, Cutler ran on that issue 18 years ago in his own, while he was in leadership, while they had the Republican governor that he said for 4 years, they never ended the automatic pay raise. Every time you vote for a budget as a representative, you're voting for your own automatic pay raise. And so I think that government needs to be reduced, and it's going to start with leadership. People that will not do these things. People that look at this as a service. You know, we talk about term limits. I'm term limiting myself to 10 years. It's not just a pledge to you, but it's actually a statement to Harrisburg that I'm not there for the big R. I'm there for the liberties and freedoms and principles of the Constitution that our party should be standing for.
Okay. We're going to give each candidate a closing statement period here, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So tonight we're starting with Bryan for closing statements. They'll each get the full 2 minutes for that piece as well. So, Bryan.
Thank you again for such an interest in this. I think it's important. I think it's important that we have the opportunity to discuss issues. And I appreciate you being willing to host and everybody being willing to participate. I also appreciate that you are, in fact, both live streaming it. Hopefully I didn't hear of any difficulties, so that went off okay. I'd like to correct a few of the statements earlier. When you discuss where we're at in the budget, I think it's also important to note that we've in fact been paying our bills. Bills that for decades had been ignored. One of the reasons that our state budget went up is because they hid expenses offline for years. I brought them back online. What do I mean by that? I'm going to give you a very real-world example. I know that Mr. Nissley has concerns with the last budget that we passed under Governor Wolf and the budgets that are currently being proposed under Governor Shapiro. I do too. I didn't vote for the first budget that Shapiro asked for. But back to the budget from 2022, and this is important. One of the ways that the state made ends meet was they simply didn't pay their bills. They didn't pay home health aides that went out and took care of the elderly. They would delay that bill payment for up to 90 or more days. What did that bill equate to? $1.7 billion in back pay that was owed. So the agencies had to borrow money, it increased the cost of doing business, and it hurt people. So we paid that. That showed up in the budget as an expense. I will never apologize for paying for our bills. Additionally, the pension costs, particularly for Pennsylvania school employees, has skyrocketed. It's the #1 driver for property taxes. So as I come here tonight, I agree that we need to have change. I think that if you look at my entire record and not just cherry pick certain facts or areas, you will see a consistent, transparent, and accountable record. So I do agree that we need change, but I think it's at the national level, not here. If we've managed our debt, paid our bills, and saved for emergencies, fought billions in tax increases, limited the governor's emergency powers being the first in the state and fight for election integrity, why would we ever change that?
You know,
Go ahead, Dave.
I want to thank Representative Cutler's team for gaining us a lot of votes in this race, as they have accused me of so many things. For example, just yesterday we got a mailer that said that I was missing a lot of the Planning Commission meetings, and surprise to most of you, that's a volunteer job. And so it's just fascinating that every time they do that, I get a couple people say, well, that does it, I'm voting for you. And, you know, as we look at this race, we realize that there's a fundamental difference in our worldviews. And having a deeply constitutional worldview, it requires you to look at life, it requires you to look at government through this lens. And so in COVID, for example, non-essential business is an essential business. You all remember that line that Wolf gave us. And Cutler's on the floor arguing that more businesses should be essential, while he should have been arguing that all business is essential, because we have a constitutional right to work. We have a biblical mandate to work, and we have a personal responsibility to our families to work. You know, we love the stories when the hero comes to the rescue. And many times that's not the reality, though. You know, during the Revolutionary War, there was 200 battles fought. There was an 8-year span, and General Washington was only present at 17 of them. They couldn't call General Washington and tell him to quickly come. Who fought those battles? The people did, with their neighbors. They stood up, and it's our chance in the 100th. This is happening across the state, where the people are being tired of the career politics, the career politicians, and the disconnect from the people. We want this party to be the party of the people again. Let's restore the Republican Party. Vote for me on April 23rd.
Okay.